Gateway conditions. Here we can see an example of a class of process that needs to manage in different tasks the lines of a group of fields based on their content. And we want to move the flow in one direction or another one based on the content of these containers. So first of all, here we have a customer request where they add different requests to a group of fields and they indicate the type. So two of these requests are related to support and two of these requests are related to training. So this administrator here is the one who inputs this information. So he classifies all the requests. He says, okay, this customer has added 4 requests, but I'm going to classify 2 as for support and 2 as for training. Afterwards, the flow is going to go into this transfer system task, and it's going to move these lines to 2 different containers. So there's one container, it's called support container, where all the lines that meet the condition that in the column type it contains support, they're going to be dropped into this container. And in the training container, we're going to drop all the lines that meet the condition that in the column type is equal to training. And in this case, since we don't have any lines for marketing, we're not going to fill up a container that's called a marketing container. Now, we can use these containers in the conditions of a gateway. So based on this gateway and its conditions, we can redirect the flow to different tasks depending on the content of the containers. For example, here the gateway is going to evaluate all the lines of the different containers in order to send the flow to support, marketing, or training. And in this scenario, since there's only content in the container support and in the container training, it's going to activate these 2 tasks, but it's not going to activate the marketing task. Okay? Here we can see how it's configured. The flow enters the gateway, and the gateway has to have conditions for each one of its outlets. Now, when we create one of these conditions, we can select here in the source panel, and in the option field, we could actually select a group of fields or a container. So if we select a group of fields here, down here, we have to select the container. And based on the content of the group of fields or the container, we could say, do we want to establish a condition based on the pattern value or on its content? So here we have the option variation. We can say, was there a variation in the content of this container? Was there not a variation in the content of the container? Did the content increase? Did it decrease? Or do we just not care about the variation, so we're just going to leave it indifferent? And maybe the only thing we want to evaluate is the value. So let's say, for example, in the scenario I just showed you guys, where we have content in 2 different containers, I'd probably select here in this first option, I'd select variation indifferent because I don't really care about the variation, if it increased, if it decreased, or whatever. So I just say variation indifferent. And then over here, I'd say content equals to yes. So here I select the group of fields, the first thing. Then I select a container. And then over here, I'd select that it has to have content in order for the flow to be directed through the outlets of this DO gateway. So here we can see every time a container is filled in, the system is going to register if there has been a variation in the content of that container. So this is the information that the system task is going to use in order to know if it has to move the lines to one container or another one based on the variation. So the variation is not something that we have to define anywhere or we have to configure. This is something that the system internally knows. Another interesting option that we can use is the footers of the groups of fields or even the footers of the containers. So here, for example, let's say in source, I select a footer. Based on the information of that footer, I could also redirect the flow. So I could use the footers to condition the flow that's going to go through one outlet or another one. For example, here we have a DO gateway, and the process flow should go to a supervisor if the offer, if the total amount of an offer is greater than 10,000. But maybe we just want to evaluate the footer of a group of fields or only of a container of a group of fields. For example, only the lines that have been approved and are in a container approved, for example, and only when the footer is greater than 10,000, then I want the flow to go to this reviewer. We could actually create conditions based on the footers, on the footers of a container, or even comparing footers of different containers. Okay, so do we want the gateway to evaluate the current offer price, or do we want it to evaluate the initial offer price from when these lines were created? So let's say in a process I had different offers and I had a certain price and I have a footer, and the footer might have a total of 10,000, let's say. But later on throughout the process, maybe there's been certain discounts added, certain taxes, and so on. So the content of these lines have actually changed. And maybe at the end I have another container with a final amount in a different footer that I can compare with the initial offer that has been sent to the customer. So I could say, okay, if the current offer is still the same as the initial offer when someone triggered or launched the process, then I want the flow to be redirected in this direction or another one. Okay, so we can create conditions based on containers and also based on footers.